Imagine the moon hanging low in the sky, casting a silver glow over a world untouched by electricity, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the natural ebb and flow of light and darkness. Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey back in time where sleep was not the seamless escape we often take for granted today, but a curious segmented ritual that would astonish even the most seasoned insomniac. Before we delve into this enigmatic world of slumber, take a moment to dim your lights. Perhaps let a gentle breeze from a fan whisper through the room, and prepare to embark on an exploration of sleep, as medieval people experienced it, a time when the night was not merely for rest, but a canvas for a peculiar kind of wakefulness. In an era without the hum of TikTok or the glow of screens, medieval individuals embraced a sleep pattern that would puzzle today's sleep hygiene aficionados. They practiced what historians call segmented sleep, a natural two-phase cycle as neatly divided as the day itself. After the sun dipped below the horizon, these early risers would retire early, sinking into what was known as the first sleep. But here's where it gets intriguing. After about 4 hours, they would awaken not out of disturbance, but by design. This interlude, this nocturnal intermission, was not insomnia. It was a cultural norm, a time for medieval midnight multitasking. This period was anything but quiet. Imagine, if you will, the medieval household stirring with activity, prayers murmured in the dim light, sacred texts perused, fires tended, and livestock checked to ensure all was well in the quiet of night. And yes, this twilight time was also deemed ideal for intimacy, as medieval marriage manuals suggest, hinting that a well-rested body and a calm mind made for a peaceful, if not slightly sleepy, romantic encounter. So as you nestle into your own modern sanctuary, ponder this. Have you ever considered that your ancestors might have been the true romantics, finding love in the lull between two sleeps? As dawn's early light creeps it through the window, you might find yourself brewing coffee for your beloved, cherishing the quiet intimacy of the morning. But pause for a moment and consider how your ancestors' sleep patterns would astonish you. Imagine them waking up in the heart of the night, not with a sense of urgency, but as part of their natural cycle. This second sleep, a gentle interlude, would last until the sun graced the horizon. From the humble farmer to the contemplative monk, this rhythm of rest was universal. Even literary giants like Chaucer would casually weave this peculiar sleep pattern into their tales, suggesting that even in the medieval world, people were no strangers to fragmented slumber. Intriguingly, modern science whispers a truth that might make you rethink your nocturnal habits. Perhaps this segmented sleep is our true natural state. In the absence of artificial light, our circadian rhythms might prefer this dance of sleep in wakefulness. So the next time the clock strikes 2 and sleep eludes you, don't fret. Instead, embrace the moment with a soft whisper, the watch has begun, and tend to the embers of a symbolic fire. Contrast this with the industrial era, where the relentless push for productivity reshaped our sleep into a strict, uninterrupted 8-hour block, treating it almost like a competitive event. In the medieval world, however, waking in the night wasn't a sign of failure, but part of the collective rhythm, whether one embraced it or not. Now let's delve into the medieval beds, or rather what passed for them. In our modern quest for sleep perfection, we fuss over thread counts and cooling technologies, dreaming of beds that feel like clouds. Yet in medieval Europe, a bed was often nothing more than a mound of once living materials, flattened by the weight of restless nights and whispered laments. The peasant's bed, a humble pallet, was straw or hay stuffed into a rough sack, if they were fortunate enough to have one. Without it was simply straw on the floor, perhaps damp, perhaps already hosting a feline companion. These pallets were far from the epitome of comfort, yet they held stories of resilience and the simple joys of human life. The straw mattresses, while not the epitome of comfort, were a humble beacon of hope in the harsh reality of medieval living. They were a choice between something and nothing, and in a world where the cold was unforgiving, straw was a godsend. Cheap and abundant, it whispered promises of warmth, albeit at the cost of sharing your bed with the less desirable company of insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse. You learn to ignore the itch, to shift subtly when bitten, and to hope for the best. For those families with a tad more fortune, or at least the strength to build, elevating the straw into a wooden frame was a small luxury. This modest upgrade offered no dramatic transformation in sleep quality, but it did slightly lessen the likelihood of a beetle serenade in your ear come morning. Linens, they were the stuff of legends, a rare indulgence. Most slumbered in the very garments that had toiled with them through the day. Pajamas were as mythical as dragons in personal space. That was a luxury reserved for the fields outside. Families huddled together, a mass of warmth and whispered stories, sometimes even sharing the same straw pile. If you grew too warm, you could find yourself nestled into your cousin's elbow, an impromptu pillow of kinship. Meanwhile, nobles reclined in grandeur upon their opulent beds. Their wooden frames, feather mattresses, and embroidered sheets spoke of wealth, with canopies to fend off drafts and with luck the lice. These beds were not just furniture, but heirlooms often willed to descendants, a testament to their value. You didn't inherit mere land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's feather bed, each lump a story of its own. For the common folk, however, a bed was not about comfort. It was about survival, about not succumbing to the cold, about evading the clucking of chickens, and perhaps, just perhaps, dreaming of a future where you might rest on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we speak of a nightcap today, we envision a warm, spirited drink, perhaps by a crackling fire leading to questionable decisions. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was a literal hat, often an amusing sight worn to keep the head warm during the long, dark nights. Imagine the chill of a medieval night seeping through the crevices of stone walls, the wind whispering its cold secrets through gaps in the thatched roofs, with windows no more substantial than thin animal horn or oiled parchment. The icy breath of winter was an unwelcome guest in every home. Central heating. That was a luxury reserved for the canine companions sprawled by the hearth, their warmth a small comfort in the vast, frigid expanses of the room. Enter the nightcap, a humble yet ingenious garment designed to keep your head from turning into an icicle while you slumbered. These were not just any hats. They were crafted from wool linen or whatever warm scraps could be pilfered without the family goat noticing. For men, it was a practical necessity. For women, it often doubled as a coif or head wrap, ensuring modesty and perhaps hiding hair that hadn't seen soap since the last Lenten season. But these caps were more than mere warmth. They carried social significance too. In certain regions, a married woman's head was expected to be covered at all times, even in the sanctuary of sleep. And let's not overlook the status these caps could convey. Embroidered or dyed, they were miniature banners of one's standing in society. Indeed, what better way to flaunt your success than by adorning your head with a testament to your wealth as you drifted into dreams? In bustling urban areas, the nightcap served another purpose. If you answered your door wearing one, it was as if you were saying, "I'm not dressed for company, please come another time." It was the medieval equivalent of a "do not disturb" sign. Paired often with night shirts, long loose tunics, reminiscent of Ebenezer Scrooge. Before his ghostly encounter, sleepwear was not about allure, but about utility. It was itchy, occasionally flammable, and always practical, ensuring that even in the depths of winter, a semblance of warmth was maintained. Imagine, if you will, the weary traveler of medieval Europe, whose journey has been long and arduous. Perhaps you are this traveler, a merchant with wares to sell a pilgrim seeking salvation, or simply someone whose mule has surrendered to exhaustion somewhere along the dusty path to Norwich. The sight of an inn, a beacon of refuge, stirs hope within your tired bones. Yet the reality inside is far from the comforting embrace of a private room or even a bed to call your own. In those times, the concept of personal space was as foreign as the exotic goods you might be trading. Upon inquiring for a place to rest, you are not ushered into solitude, but rather into a communal bed already warmed by the presence of others. Medieval inns were not sanctuaries of solitude, but bustling bunkhouses where efficiency trumped privacy. Here in this shared bed, you might find yourself nestled next to snoring strangers, or those who mutter in their sleep, or perhaps someone with an alarming array of skin eruptions. Yet this was not deemed impolite or invasive. It was simply the most practical use of limited resources. Beds could accommodate multiple souls, 2, 3, or even 4, depending on the bed's breadth and the traveler's tolerance for close quarters. In the heart of bustling cities, you might find yourself in a dormitory-like hall where beds lined the walls and personal space was a myth. Here, snoring was an unspoken competition, and elbow room was a battleground. Occasionally, inns attempted to segregate by profession or gender, but often it was a free-for-all, a chaotic sprawl of first come, first served. While today's germaphobes might shudder at such an arrangement back then, it was a step up from braving the wild, where wolves howled, rain pelted, and peasant uprisings were not uncommon. Concerned about your possessions. Many would sleep with their purse securely tied to their belt or cleverly concealed beneath their garments. Some even transformed their luggage into makeshift pillows, using them as both comfort and a rudimentary alarm system. If someone dared to move your bag, you'd know. In this world, the notion of sharing a bed with strangers was not just accepted, it was the very essence of survival on the road. How does one find solace in such closeness? You might wonder, yet in those shared moments amidst the collective breath and heartbeat of fellow travelers, there was a peculiar kind of comfort, a reminder that in the vast, unpredictable world, human connection, even in its simplest form, could be a balm for the weary soul. Imagine the medieval night descending upon the world, where the act of retiring to bed was far more than just a physical retreat into slumber. It was an emotional and spiritual journey, a nightly pilgrimage, where one's very soul hung in the balance. The stakes were high, for sleep could mean a journey from which one might not return. The rich, ensconced in their comfort, did not share this common dread. Nobles with their entourages could demand the finest rooms or camp in opulence, far removed from the common peril. But for the common folk, bedtime was not merely about snuggling under the covers. Oh no, it was a sacred ritual, a gamble with eternity, where the currency was one's spiritual purity. One did not just sleep, one prepared for the possibility of death. Hence, the bedtime prayers were not whispers of comfort, but cries for mercy. Forget the modern whispers of lavender or the soft hum of calming tunes. Medieval souls wound down with confessions, psalms, and spiritual clauses, hoping these would cleanse them in case they met their maker before the morning light. The simplicity of the idea was stark. Death could come at any moment from illness, fire demons, or the silent terror of reaching the dreaded age of 30 in the year 1247. Thus, prayers were not for comfort, but for salvation, for who would wish to arrive at the gates of hell, uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. The common prayer, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," might seem sweet at first blush, but it was essentially a child's legal acknowledgement of death's looming presence at bedtime. Adults, however, had an entire repertoire of prayers for various nightly threats. One for guilt, another for the lurking devil in the rafters, and even one for plague prevention, though sadly it aged like milk left out in the sun. Some turned to specific saints, their guardians in the night, akin to celestial bouncers at the door of the soul's nightclub. The most devout monks, nuns, and nobles, with a penchant for anxiety, concluded their day with Compline, the final prayer service, before bed. After this, they took a vow of silence, which was no great hardship, for by then everyone was already steeped in the solemn anticipation of what might come in the night. Exhausted, undernourished, and with a whisper of fear of the looming darkness, children were nudged toward prayer. This wasn't merely for the nourishment of their souls, but also to divert their minds from pondering why the family dog had once again claimed their bed. Parents reassured them of the presence of watchful angels, a notion that sounds endearing until you grasp its true essence, more of a divine surveillance than a comforting guardian. Indeed, bedtime prayers were less about finding peace and more akin to a desperate last-minute plea for protection, much like a medieval antivirus software. You hoped it would work, even if the mechanics were a mystery. In today's world, dreams are often brushed off as mere neurological housekeeping or the bizarre byproducts of stress and dietary indiscretions. But in the medieval era, dreams were not to be trifled with. They held the weight of eternal implications. They were not just nightly escapades of the mind. They were potent messages from the divine, the saints, the devil, or perhaps even that odd relic you kissed last Sunday at church. Whether a dream was a divine revelation or a demonic lure, it demanded attention. One might need to write it down, confess it, or undertake a 3-day fast just to err on the side of caution. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries devoted countless hours to the art of dream interpretation, with entire volumes penned on the subject. Dreaming of fire might foretell a descent into hell, while water could symbolize purification or a dire warning of drowning. And should one dream of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, immediate consultation with a priest was advisable, perhaps with thoughts of relocating for good measure. Medieval folks believed fervently that dreams were significant because the soul remained active even in slumber. This meant that one's actions in dreams could unearth hidden sins or spiritual frailties. That mildly embarrassing dream where you pilfered a loaf of bread, it could be a sign of deeper, unacknowledged transgressions. Imagine the stakes. Your very soul's journey could hang in the balance of these nocturnal adventures. Perhaps in the quiet whispers of our dreams, we find ourselves confessing the sins of our waking gluttony. Or maybe it's just the pangs of hunger speaking. Yet in the spirit of caution, why not confess anyway? Monks and nuns of old diligently noted their nocturnal visions, sharing them with their spiritual mentors. Some were exalted for experiencing divine apparitions in slumber, while others were gently advised to perhaps limit their onion intake before retiring. Dreams, however, transcended mere spiritual conundrums. They were the medieval equivalent of today's cinematic thrillers, ripe with knights facing off against celestial beings, demons, or creatures of allegory, each reciting verses on virtue. Imagine dreams as the Netflix of the Middle Ages, rich in symbolism, where happy endings were scarce. The church, ever vigilant, viewed these nocturnal narratives with suspicion. Not every dream was a divine message. Some were thought to be the devil's work corrupting the pure of heart. A dream of something unsavory might signal a soul under siege, or perhaps you simply inhaled too much smoke from the fireplace. Today, we might choose to share our beds with pets for companionship, a decision tinged with both affection and the occasional scent of wet fur. But in medieval times, cohabitation with animals was less about personal choice and more a strategy for warmth. Medieval homes were not built for luxury. With stone walls that offered no warmth drafts so fierce they might have had their own names, and central heating often being the family pig comfort was a luxury few could afford. In the homes of peasants, it was common for humans and livestock to share not just rooms but often beds, and frequently the same heap of straw. Chickens roamed freely, dogs nestled at your feet, and pigs snorted softly by the hearth. This arrangement wasn't about love, though affection for animals did exist, but about survival. The warmth from these creatures was a necessity in the chill of the night. And so as we ponder these ancient ways, we must ask ourselves, how far have we really come from those times when survival dictated our sleeping arrangements? Oh, the warmth of a medieval home. Picture this, a cozy space where the flicker of the hearth casts dancing shadows on the walls and the gentle breath of your loyal dog keeps your toes from turning to icicles. Imagine the gentle moo of a cow nestled in the corner, its body heat a godsend, raising the room's temperature by a precious degree or two. In the depths of January, such warmth felt nothing short of miraculous. In these simple one-room dwellings where life unfolded in its entirety, cooking, eating, sleeping, and yes, even the occasional passing, there was a harmony between man and beast. Children cocooned between their parents, and perhaps a friendly goat found comfort in the closeness. And who needed an alarm clock when a chicken could rouse you at dawn with its crow? But let's not delve too deeply into the matter of hygiene. For the nobility, the scenario was slightly different. They might not have shared their beds with livestock, but a lapdog was often present not for warmth, but as a statement of fashion, and perhaps for the redistribution of fleas. Some lords took this to an extreme, providing their favored pets with separate sleeping quarters. Indeed, what better way to flaunt one's power than to give a dog its own room, complete with a title? Yet this rustic, animal-inclusive living wasn't without its quirks. Animals, bless their hearts, are not known for their decorum or their respect for personal space. A hoof in the face at the witching hour. Just another night's work. If you've ever grumbled about sharing a youth hostel room, let me introduce you to the medieval monastic dormitory where comfort went to die a silent death. Here in the stark simplicity of monastic life, personal space was a luxury as foreign as laughter. The dormitory, a vast chamber, housed dozens of monks, each sleeping in neat rows like morally upright sardines. Their beds, if one could call them that, were often just wooden planks. On rare occasions, a straw mattress graced these frames, a nod to generosity from the abbot, or perhaps a celebration of a feast day. And they slept fully clothed, ready for any call to prayer or emergency. Imagine the heart-wrenching struggle of slipping into robes at 2 a.m., not out of modesty, but because the alternative dressing in the pitch-black chill was far more agonizing than simply retiring to bed already clad in the monastic uniform. This attire, encompassing robe belt and sandals, was not merely clothing, it was a spiritual shield, albeit one that offered scant warmth. If the cold gnawed at your bones, you would layer up, but if the heat came, there was no relief. There were no pillows to cradle your head, no curtains to grant solitude, and absolutely no chatter. Silence was not merely recommended. It was the vow under St. Benedict's rule. A mere groan in the night could earn you a week's worth of chamber pot duty, while snoring, though beyond control, might still draw divine or communal ire. The setting was austere, with perhaps one lone candle flickering in the darkness. You didn't need light to see. You needed only to lie still to keep sin at bay. That was the essence, the core purpose of this rigorous existence. Despite the severity, these monks believed their Spartan beds were a rehearsal for the afterlife, a preparation for the soul's journey, by denying the flesh any hint of indulgence. Sleep was not an indulgence here. It was a necessity, strictly scheduled and monitored, like all aspects of monastic life. Some even chose to sleep sitting up, eschewing any semblance of comfort, luxury, or even the risk of vivid dreams. Oh, how the simple straw beds of peasants with snoring pigs for company might seem almost opulent in comparison. At least the pig offered no judgment. Let us ponder a practice that would send shivers down the spine of most modern sleepers, voluntarily rising at 2 a.m., not for a midnight snack or a quick scroll through the latest news, but for prayer, for loud, bone-chilling, candle-lit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was the norm. Monks and nuns adhered to a rigorous schedule of canonical hours, with matins marking the first service of the day, or rather the darkest, most silent hour of the night. The owls, perched in their nocturnal indecision, fluttered with the uncertainty of dawn. Then, as if summoned by an unseen force, the bell tolled a somber, resonant chime, its peal often the duty of the least fortunate among them. From the dormitory, a procession of robed figures emerged, their eyes heavy with the weight of sleep deprivation. There they were, clad not in the comfort of pajamas, but in the solemn attire of their calling, for, in this realm, the only layers recognized were those of the soul. Under the dim flicker of candles within the hallowed stone vaults of the chapel, these weary souls gathered. Here in the quietude of the early morn, they would chant ancient psalms, their voices a soft echo against the cold stone, reciting scriptures with a fervor that fought against the pull of slumber. Indeed, staying awake was a challenge, and history whispers tales of those caught napping during matins, facing penance through additional chores or extended prayers. You dozed off during matins, one might jest. Congratulations, you're now leading the next one. Matins stretching beyond an hour, sometimes even two, and the more zealous orders tested their spiritual endurance. Picture the scene: bodies craving rest, stomachs echoing with the memory of a meager dinner of lentils, and minds grappling to maintain sanctity. After the service, choices were few: retreat for a second fragmented sleep, or in the stricter cloisters, proceed directly to study or labor. This was the essence of holy discipline, threshing wheat with limbs that yearned for rest. Why such an early hour? The purpose was clear: to offer the first purest moments of the day to God, unmarred by daylight's distractions, warmth's comfort, or the deep embrace of REM sleep. It was a profound testament to their devotion, a symbol that spoke louder than any words once you moved past the numbing cold, the haze of candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chants. In our modern world, solitude in sleep is often celebrated as a luxury, a mark of personal space, peace, or simply the control over one's blanket. But in the medieval tapestry, sleeping alone was considered. In the chill of yesteryears, warmth was a luxury, beds a far cry from the cozy havens we know today. Imagine stone walls, frigid and unyielding, paired with open chimneys that offered little more than a visual dance of flame. Central heating, that was a dream as distant as the stars. Thus, people huddled together in shared slumber, not for intimacy, but for sheer survival against the cold. Children nestled beside siblings, parents, and occasionally the neighbor's offspring on a visit, turning every night into an impromptu sleepover, though none ever asked for an invitation. Yet there was more to this communal repose than mere physical warmth. The darkness of night was a time when the devil was believed to be at his busiest. Alone, one's soul might be ripe for temptation or worse, possession. Having companions nearby formed a sort of spiritual safety net, a moral buffer where any misdeed or supernatural encounter would have witnesses. For the young ones, solitude at night was unthinkable, not merely for comfort, but because the night was alive with tales of ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits. These stories, far from the comforting bedtime narratives of today, concluded not with hugs, but with disappearances. Even married couples in an era where privacy was more myth than reality often found their beds crowded with children, servants, or unexpected guests. The notion of two souls alone in a vast bed would have seemed not only wasteful, but suspiciously indulgent. In religious settings, even monks slept communally, and to be assigned solitary sleep was often a form of punishment. Medieval wisdom held that solitude and sleep bred opportunity for sin, whereas group slumber ensured public accountability. Isn't it fascinating how our ancestors' fears shaped their very way of life? What does this tell us about the power of belief and community in the face of darkness? Imagine, if you will, the sweet solitude of your own bed, the comforting weight of your blanket, and the absence of any goat-like odors. The silence wraps around you like a velvet cloak, a stark contrast to what would have been your reality in the medieval era. Picture this: instead of this serene solitude, you would share your bed with two children, a snoring sheepdog, and perhaps even a snoring cousin. But let's delve deeper into the medieval mindset. Ever woken up from an unintended nap in a lecture hall, a jolting carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, only to find your neck stiff and your mind clouded with regret? In those times, sleeping upright was not a mishap, but a deliberate choice. The wealthy and the devout in particular opted for this peculiar sleeping posture. Why, you might ask? The reasons were manifold, none conducive to a good night's rest. Firstly, there was a quaint medical theory that lying flat could disrupt digestion, suffocate the lungs, or throw off the body's delicate humoral balance. In an age where physicians believed a sneeze could realign your very soul, this made a curious sort of sense. Sleeping upright was thought to prevent cerebral congestion, a fancy term for not drowning in your own phlegm. On the spiritual front, there were darker considerations. Lying flat was too reminiscent of death's cold embrace. Why risk confusing the Almighty or heaven, forbid attracting the gaze of the angel of death by adopting a posture synonymous with funerals? Superstition, certainly. Yet when your local priest also served as the village's medical advisor, you treaded carefully. As a result, people often slept in a semi-reclined position propped up by hefty bolsters, stacks of pillows, or even wooden headboards that could be described as the medieval equivalent of a recliner. Nobles went so far as to customize their beds with angled supports ideal for digesting their hearty evening meals or warding off unexpected demonic visitations. Monks, ever the exemplars of asceticism, took this practice to an extreme, their beds designed not for comfort, but for spiritual vigilance. In the quiet corners of medieval slumber, one might find a figure not draped in the comfort of soft linens, but instead perched awkwardly on a bench or leaning against a stone wall, wrapped only in a hood for meager solace. Why, you ask? Oh, not for health's sake nor for comfort. It was discipline, a stern master, that dictated these harsh conditions. Too much comfort, and dreams might wander. Dreams, those gateways to sin, would lead one straight to the early morning confessional. Imagine, if you will, the scene, not one of rest, but of virtue of discomfort and of a theology that dances on the edges of confusion. Forget the goblins and specters of folklore. For the medieval soul, the real terrors lurked within the very fabric of their beds. Tiny, relentless, and utterly indifferent to your nightly prayers, these were not the stuff of nightmares, but of reality. We speak of fleas, lice, and the bedroom's unwelcome mascot, the bedbug. Let's be frank, hygiene in medieval Europe was not its forte. Baths were a luxury, laundry a costly affair, and soap, well, let's not delve into its ingredients. Picture the scene: straw-stuffed mattresses, shared bedding, and perhaps a chicken scuttling beneath your feet. The perfect banquet for pests. Fleas and lice were not just visitors, but near permanent residents. Even the nobility, with their satin sheets and lofty feather beds, could not escape these tiny tormentors. Indeed, some affluent households even employed nitpickers, servants, whose sole duty was to pick lice from their master's hair and garments. Imagine, if you can, the peculiar pride in being the master of the royal scalp. And bedbugs, they were the silent assassins of the night, lurking in the wooden frames, the seams of mattresses, and the cracks of stone walls, emerging under the cloak of darkness to feast like minuscule vampires. If one wonders why medieval folk donned nightcaps and slept in their clothes, it was not merely for warmth. No, it was a form of armor, a defense against these nightly invaders. Solutions to these pests range from the practical to the bizarre. Some households resorted to burning potent herbs. In the quest for a peaceful slumber, medieval folks resorted to peculiar bedfellows. Imagine trying to fend off pesky bugs with herbs like wormwood or tansy. Some even nestled with garlic, onions, or ashes, sacrificing any chance at romance for a bit of pest control. But the discomfort wasn't merely physical. Fleas, those tiny tormentors, were often viewed as symbols of sin or moral decay, their bites a constant irritating reminder of human imperfection. Entire poems were crafted around these creatures, some moralizing, others bizarrely romantic, as if to say, our love is as deep as the flea that bites us both. Now, while today's sleep might be shattered by the glare of streetlights or the incessant buzz of smartphones, medieval nights were a symphony of scratching and twitching, the unsettling sensation of something crawling on your shin. And indeed it was. We've all known restless nights, but have you ever attempted to drift off while encased in 100 pounds of iron? No. Well, during those times, some did, believing that the best lullaby was the clank of armor ready to joust in their dreams. To clarify, not everyone, not even knights, slept regularly in full armor. It was an ordeal, hot, heavy, and clattering. Imagine trying to turn over in a suit of chainmail. It's akin to napping in a sack of cutlery. Yet in times of war or in enemy lands, sleeping partially armored was the prudent choice. Comfort was negotiable. Survival was not. A knight on campaign might see a warrior removing only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on just in case adversaries chose to throw a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking to the sound of hooves scrambling into battle gear while still half dreaming of turnips. In besieged castles, men-at-arms might even keep swords or axes at their side, ever ready, ever vigilant. In the medieval era, when the night was as much a battlefield as the day, warriors often turned to sleep as a necessary respite, albeit a somewhat perilous one. Imagine, if you will, soldiers wrapped in their armor, like some very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields not only served as a defense against foes, but doubled as makeshift pillows. And if by some misfortune the enemy breached the castle walls, there was at least one small consolation. You wouldn't have to waste time dressing. However, sleeping in armor was anything but restorative. Iron, as we know, isn't exactly breathable, and chainmail had an irritating penchant for pinching skin. Picture the scene: cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient chorus of snoring comrades and crackling torches. This sleep environment ranks somewhere below an airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not engaged in battle, like traveling merchants or vigilant guards, might nap in gambesons, thick quilted jackets, offering a modicum of protection and slightly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. And let's not overlook the subtlety of armor. One wrong roll in the night, and the clanking might awaken the entire barracks, leading everyone to believe the apocalypse was upon them once more. In times when nightly demons, lice infestations, and unexpected pigs in your bed were not out of the ordinary, sleepwalking was far more than a mere inconvenience. Oh, but it was much more dramatic than that. During the Middle Ages, if you were caught wandering in your sleep, people didn't simply attribute it to stress or fatigue. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had some unresolved issues with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and deeply feared. The thought of someone rising from their straw pallet, shuffling across the room to stare blankly at a wall, was less a harmless parasomnia and more like a rehearsal dinner for the devil himself. Imagine this: a man in a long nightshirt holding a candle. In the dimly lit hours of the medieval night, with eyes glazed like the fogged windows of a frostbitten morning, the sleepwalker stumbled through the chaos of the farmyard, his lips mumbling incoherent Latin, a language he did not truly know. To the onlooker, he might have seemed a ghost, or worse, a heretic teetering on the edge of the supernatural or the sacrilegious. Imagine the shock, the whispers of an exorcism, perhaps hastily arranged before the morning meal. Some in those times whispered that sleepwalking was the work of bad humors, particularly an excess of black bile, the medieval panacea for the unexplained. Others pondered if the soul in its nightly escape left the body to wander like a rudderless ship. Desperate to keep these nocturnal escapades at bay, people resorted to herbal concoctions, fervent prayers whispered over beds, iron charms dangling like silent guardians, or in the more rustic locales, securing the sleepwalker's leg to furniture. Consider the peril homes were battlegrounds of open hearths, strewn knives, and chamber pots poised for disaster. There were even tales, perhaps embellished, of somnambulists scaling rooftops. The fear of a dreaming leap led to barred windows and deep theological debates: could one sin while asleep? Yet most sleepwalkers simply paced, muttered, or tried in vain to open doors that existed only in their dreams. If one ventured into a church, oh, the fervor it could ignite. Was it a divine sign, or merely a call for a spiritual cleansing to ensure all was well in the eyes of the divine? In this age of tumult, sleep was a luxury, a fleeting escape from the cacophony of life. Church bells told the passage of sacred time, marking sunrise prayers, meals, and the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. For those near a monastery, these sounds were not merely interruptions, but the medieval symphony of survival. Imagine, amidst the clanging of bells, the rumble of thunderstorms, the cries of livestock, and the distant clamor of sieges finding peace in slumber. These were not mere noises, but the lullaby of a world in constant motion. Amidst the relentless chiming of the church bells, their rhythmic tolling became the lullaby of a soul ensnared by the demands of a bustling existence. At some juncture, the mind simply surrendered to the ceaseless melody, accepting it as a soothing, albeit compulsory, serenade. Yet it was not only the bells that intruded upon the quietude of the night. Storms, too, were frequent, their fury unabated. Without the modern conveniences of weather forecasts or soundproofing, each thunderous clap was an earth-shattering event, a harbinger of potential doom. Roofs wept, windows shuddered, and chimneys wailed like tormented spirits. Yet sleep was not a luxury one could afford to miss. Work with its unyielding demands did not pause for sleepless nights. Neither did the essential tasks of plowing the fields, offering prayers, or fleeing from the terror of Viking raids. And speaking of such calamities, even the direst of times did not always deter the slumbering masses. In the 14th century, amidst famine, war, and the chilling specter of the Black Death, people still found rest. When the death carts trundled past in the dawn, their grim passage was more a somber alarm than a signal to panic. If one did not awaken, some might have considered it a merciful release. There are even accounts of individuals sleeping through the tremors of earthquakes, the roar of barn fires, and the tumult of angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was as common as the daily bread, and bodies adapted. Toiling from dawn till dusk, surviving on meager sustenance, and navigating life's myriad obstacles, from mud to taxes to the threat of eternal damnation, one was destined to succumb to a deep restorative slumber. Yet there were those who embraced sleep not just as a necessity, but as an escape, a momentary reprieve from the relentless onslaught of illness, grief, or the fear of an impending apocalypse, which seemed to loom on the horizon every century. Some would simply wrap themselves in a cloak, whisper a prayer, and surrender to the peace of sleep. There's a peculiar wisdom in such surrender. As the winter of 1602 enveloped Salem, Massachusetts, the village was swathed not just in snow, but in an atmosphere thick with tension, suspicion, and a pervasive quiet dread that permeated the timber-framed homes and the frost-bitten fields. Here the Puritans, with their stringent beliefs and deep-seated superstitions, faced the world with a resolve hardened by faith and fear. In the heart of the wilderness, they toiled, believing they were erecting not just a settlement, but a sanctified city on a hill. Its every stone laid under the watchful gaze of God, its shadows haunted by the lurking presence of Satan. Life in its rawest form was already an arduous journey. The village had torn itself from the embrace of Salem town, driven by fierce debates over politics and faith. Their fields had betrayed them, yielding no bounty. Smallpox had swept through neighboring lands like a merciless reaper. The scars of wars with the native tribes ran deep, leaving many with wounds that were not merely physical. Tension simmered between neighbors, fueled by disputes over inheritance and a seething resentment towards those who dared to be different. And then the long, dark, bitter winter of New England clamped down upon them like a vice, squeezing the last drops of hope from their hearts. Something had to give, and it did within the very walls of the Reverend Samuel Parris's home, the spiritual anchor of their community. His young daughter, Betty, merely 9 years old, and his niece, Abigail Williams, just 11, began to exhibit behaviors that chilled the blood. Their screams pierced the heavy air. Objects flew as if by invisible hands, their bodies twisted into forms that defied nature itself. At times, they would fall into a haunting silence, their eyes wide, as if beholding visions of terror. Whispers spread like wildfire through the village where they cursed. The girls spoke of being pinch-bitten by forces unseen. Reverend Parris, at a loss, summoned Dr. William Griggs, the local physician. After his examinations bore no fruit, Griggs uttered a word that ignited the smoldering fears of Salem witchcraft. In a world where witches were seen as real and dangerous minions of the devil, this was no mere superstition. If the devil could breach the sanctity of the minister's own household, what hope was there for the rest? The girls, nudged by the anxious adults, and their peers began to point fingers. At first, they accused those on the fringes of society, the outcasts and the misfits. But the accusations soon climbed the social ladder, reaching the respectable, the affluent, even the devout. Salem was but a tiny village, yet the ripples of what was about to unfold would disturb waters far beyond its modest borders. From whispers cloaked in the darkness, an ominous chorus of cries soon echoed from the gallows, weaving a legacy of fear that still sends shivers through the pages of America's historical tapestry. In the shadowed heart of Salem, The notion of witchcraft took root as insidious as ivy, initially silent, but soon suffocating all in its path. The afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and later Ann Putnam Jr., and Mercy Lewis grew audacious by the day. Their bodies writhed in courtrooms, their voices pierced the sanctity of prayers, and they pointed accusing fingers claiming to see dark apparitions hovering over certain souls. This was no mere child's play. It was a spectacle, public and chillingly credible. The first to bear the weight of accusation were those least shielded by society's embrace the outcasts, those who danced on the fringes of acceptance. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, known for her muttered curses when turned away, was the epitome of a witch in the eyes of Salem's puritanical gaze. Her pipe smoking, her sharp words to children, her very existence outside the norms marked her as suspect. Sarah Osborne, too, found herself under scrutiny. Her absence from church, her scandalous marriage to her indentured servant after her first husband's demise, painted her as a woman who dared to defy convention. And then there was Tituba, the exotic enigma from Barbados, a slave in Reverend Paris's household. Her tales, her accent, her foreign ways, they terrified the townsfolk. Coerced, perhaps, through brutal means, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. Her confession, rather than dispelling the storm, unleashed a tempest. She spoke of a tall man in black, a figure synonymous with the devil who beckoned to her to sign a sinister book. She described visions of yellow birds, red cats, spectral dogs, each tale more damning than the last. But most chillingly, she implicated others, suggesting that the darkness of witchcraft was not solitary, but a shared communal dread. Once Tituba had cracked open the door to accusations others stormed through in a frenzy. New names were hurled into the fray each week as neighbors betrayed neighbors in a twisted dance of vengeance. Old grudges simmered beneath the surface, now erupting as righteous denunciations. Property squabbles morphed into spectral attacks. If a cow perished unexpectedly, witchcraft was surely to blame. If an infant's cry pierced through a solemn prayer, was it not the devil's mischief at play? The terror spread like wildfire, so pervasive that even the innocent chose silence over solidarity. To stand up for one accused was to court suspicion oneself. Silence became the shield. It was safer to whisper than to shout. Thus the village was ensnared in an ever-expanding web of accusations, its inhabitants caught in invisible sticky threads. Logic began to wane as hysteria took the reins. As the accusations swelled and the village's tension hit a crescendo, the colonial government under the newly appointed Governor William Phipps felt compelled to act. Eager to quell the chaos, he established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French to hear and determine. Yet what was intended as a beacon of justice soon morphed into a factory of fear-fueled verdicts. This court convening in Salem town in June of 1692 was unlike any ordinary tribunal. Panic had twisted its rules. Instead of demanding tangible proof or credible witnesses, it opened its arms to the perilous concept of spectral evidence. This was testimony where a person claimed the spirit or specter of the accused had harmed them. Imagine if someone swore they saw your ghostly apparition in a nightmare strangling them. That alone could condemn you. Never mind if you were miles away or fast asleep in church, it was your spirit, they said, doing the devil's bidding. How could one cross-examine a dream? How could one refute the intangible? Children in this twisted court became star witnesses. Their convulsions, shrieks, and gasps during the trials were not just dramatic, they were damning. Each seizure, each cry was a spectacle, a performance that sealed many fates. Ah, the day! Young Mary Walcott, barely more than a child, would descend into convulsions the instant a suspected witch entered her sight. If the accused met her gaze, she would let out a piercing shriek. Should they dare to look away, her screams would crescendo into a cacophony of despair. These theatrical displays were not only mesmerizing, but also accepted as truth by the judges, including the esteemed Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton. In these colonial trials, defense attorneys were a foreign concept. Accused individuals stood alone, isolated in their plight. Oh, how cruel the system was! If one dared to deny the charges, the afflicted girls would writhe in pain, their agony a spectacle for all to see. But confess, that might spare you from death, but only if you betrayed others to the same fate. The trials themselves became a grim carnival, drawing spectators from miles around, eager to witness the drama unfold. The accused, often bewildered and destitute, were paraded into court in chains, their powerlessness palpable. Yet not all were swayed by this spectacle of hysteria. Whispers circulated among the townsfolk, some daring to suggest the girls were mere actresses in a macabre play. Others pondered why only those of a certain ilk were accused, though few had the courage to voice their doubts aloud. To question the court was to question divine will, and in Salem reason had long since been trampled underfoot by fear. On that fateful June day in 1692, the gallows of Salem first tasted blood with Bridget Bishop as its inaugural victim. Her flamboyant attire and past accusations made her a prime target. Neighbors claimed her spirit tormented them, that misfortune followed her path, and that she possessed enchanted dolls. Despite her vehement denials, the court, mirroring not justice, but the town's darkest fears, declared her guilty. Led to Gallows Hill, a desolate windswept knoll just beyond Salem's reach, Bridget faced her end without a prayer, without mercy. As the noose tightened and the crowd watched in silent, grim fascination, one could not help but wonder, how could a community so steeped in faith lose its way so completely? As the first execution set the gears of doom into motion, the grim machinery of death began its relentless churn. In the wake of that single act, the hanging surged forth with a chilling rapidity. On July 19th, the air was heavy with sorrow as 5 more women were led to their tragic end. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse Elizabeth. How and Sarah Wilds, their fates sealed not by their deeds, but by the hysteria that gripped the town. Among them, Rebecca Nurse stood out a beacon of piety and respect in the community, her case a stark, shocking testament to the madness. Initially, the jury had seen through the veil of hysteria, declaring her not guilty. Yet under the suffocating pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, their verdict was overturned. Nurse's final words whispered through the air, a haunting echo. I am as innocent as the child unborn. But innocence was no shield. The noose knew no mercy. August saw the continuation of this dark chapter, but it was on September 22nd that the morning sky bore witness to the most heart-wrenching scene. 8 souls were taken in one fell swoop. Among them, Martha Corey, whose skepticism of the trials had marked her from the beginning, and her husband Giles, whose fate was uniquely cruel. Giles refused to enter a plea, a silent rebellion against the farce of justice. The court, stymied by his silence, invoked an ancient barbaric punishment, peine forte à dur. Over 3 agonizing days, stones were methodically added to his chest. His final words, etched in legend, were a chilling request: more weight. By the end of the hysteria, 19 had been hanged, 1 crushed under the weight of stones, and at least 5 more perished in the squalor of jail cells, their trials never to be concluded. Over 200 were accused, their lives shattered, their reputations tarnished. The gallows with its long dark shadows loomed not just over the hill, but over every heart in Salem. Fear had usurped the throne of law, and justice, blindfolded, was led to the scaffold. While the executions captured the grim spotlight, hundreds languished in the confines of cramped, foul-smelling jails, their fates hanging in the balance, hoping for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small jail could not contain the volume of human tragedy unfolding within its walls. In towns like Ipswich and Boston, where shadows clung to the walls and despair whispered through the cold air, the accused languished in chains, their bodies racked with hunger, shivering against the relentless chill, and left to fade into oblivion. These were not the outcasts or the sorcerers of legend, but neighbors, friends, parents, children, ordinary souls whose only misstep was a simple dispute or the misfortune of possessing land coveted by others. Often the accusations were mere cloaks for personal vendettas masquerading as divine retribution. Imagine the scene: a pig, errant and innocent, strays into a neighbor's yard and meets its end. Witchcraft, they cry. Or perhaps a neighbor weary from toil refuses to share their woodpile. Surely a curse has befallen the axe. Such was the plight of Mary E.'s sister to the already executed Rebecca Nurse. Known for her devotion and as a mother to 7, Mary was briefly freed by the court only to be ensnared again days later by fresh accusations from the so-called afflicted girls. Her second arrest was her undoing. In a desperate plea to the judges, Mary did not beg for her own life, but implored them to halt the madness before more innocent lives were extinguished. Her cries went unheeded. She was soon hanged. Then there was Dorothy Good, a mere 4-year-old daughter of the accused Sarah Good. Under the crushing weight of interrogation, this child confessed to witchcraft, her words a tangle of fear and confusion, yet accepted as damning evidence. She endured 8 grueling months in chains, emerging broken in spirit, her innocence shattered beyond repair. Nor were the pregnant spared in this whirlwind of hysteria. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John would later meet the gallows, faced the same grim fate. Her pregnancy, however, delayed her execution, a twist of fate that perhaps saved her life. She bore her child in the confines of a cell, eventually finding freedom only after the trials had exhausted their fervor. As accusations spiraled, some, in a bid to save themselves, confessed to witchcraft and then cast suspicion upon others. This vicious cycle drew entire families into its vortex. Fathers, wives, daughters. No one was safe from the relentless tide of accusations. How could justice be so blind and innocence so cruelly ignored? Meanwhile, the jails swelled to bursting, the iron bars barely containing the surge of humanity. Food dwindled to mere crumbs and disease festered in the shadows, claiming lives before justice could even glance their way. In the grip of Salem's witch hysteria, it mattered not who you were, but who dared to whisper your name. By the crisp air of fall in 1692, the madness began to fracture, not from a sudden awakening of the court, but from the sheer force of reality crashing back into view. The turning point was as audacious as the accusations themselves. Those who once cheered the trials found themselves ensnared in the very web they had spun. Reverend George Burroughs, once the voice of reason in Salem, now stood accused as the chief among witches. His education and eloquence, which had previously clashed with the village's powerful, were now his doom. Yet on the day of his execution, he performed a feat that echoed through the crowd like a thunderclap. Burroughs, standing on the gallows, recited the Lord's Prayer with such flawless precision that even the most hardened of hearts faltered. The crowd, hushed in disbelief, watched as some among them wept their certainty, shaken, but the execution unwavering. This moment, a seed of doubt began to sprout. Then the accusations reached the pinnacle of Salem society. Mary Phipps's wife of Governor William Phipps found herself named. Suddenly the hysteria had climbed to the highest echelons, and Governor Phipps, already rattled by the growing dissent and disorder, could no longer ignore the storm he had allowed to brew. In October of 1692, he dissolved the Court of Oyer in Termontenir, halting the trials and executions in their tracks. Public sentiment, once silent or complicit, now found its voice. Ministers who had watched from the sidelines began to denounce the folly. Increased Mather, a beacon of theological wisdom in the colony, declared it better to let 10 supposed witches escape than to condemn one innocent soul. A revolutionary thought in a society that had for months believed the opposite. Once upon a time, the same people who had once roared for justice in the trials began to whisper doubts. The prisons overflowed, yet the public's thirst for vengeance waned. Too many figures of honor had been implicated. Too many innocents had been laid to rest. What had begun as a quest for divine retribution was now recognized for what it truly was: sheer madness. Confessions, once plentiful, now trickled to a halt. Accusers who had once been so vocal now retracted their words or vanished into obscurity. The loudest voices of accusation now fell silent, their gazes cast downward in shame or fear. The terror that gripped Salem did not vanish, but it had worn itself thin. The populace yearned for peace, the officials for dignity, and Salem, battered and repentant, was finally poised to awaken from its dark dream. The storm was breaking, but oh, the scars it left behind. By late 1692, the very judicial system that had fanned the flames of hysteria started to crumble under the sheer weight of its own folly. With the dissolution of the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October, a new, more prudent court, the Superior Court of Judicature, emerged in early 1693. This time, the approach was markedly different. Spectral evidence was dismissed, and the judges approached the wild accusations with a healthy dose of skepticism. The convictions, once rampant, now slowed to a mere trickle. Many accused were outright acquitted. Out of the 56 cases presented before this new court, the majority walked free. Even those who had previously confessed began to retract their statements, revealing that their admissions were coerced by fear torture or overwhelming pressure. The dramatic antics of the afflicted girls, once so convincing, now fell flat. The unraveling of the trials was epitomized by the case of Reverend Samuel Willard, a man of high esteem and piety who found himself under suspicion. Though never formally charged, his implication underscored just how arbitrary and corrupt the entire process had become. Could justice truly be served in such a manner? Once fierce, the once fiery spirit of the town had cooled to a wary caution. They began to quietly release those still imprisoned, starting with those for whom evidence was scant, and eventually extending even to those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress. Meanwhile, the families of the executed were not silent. They roared for justice. John Proctor's children fought tirelessly to reclaim their father's property. Rebecca Nurse's kin, driven by love and righteousness, launched a fervent campaign to restore her tarnished name. As time passed, the fear that had once gripped the community was supplanted by a collective shame. Church congregations, once united, now lay in shambles. Friendships, once the very sinew of the town, were severed, leaving the social fabric of Salem in tatters. Governor Phipps, witnessing the colony's international disgrace in 1693, pardoned the remaining prisoners. Yet even freedom bore a price. Many families faced the bitter irony of having to pay their own jail fees to regain their liberty. Can you imagine the agony of losing everything: your home, your health, nearly your life, only to receive a bill for the mere privilege of survival? By the conclusion of this dark chapter, souls had been hanged, 1 had been pressed to death, 5 had perished in jail, and over 200 had been accused. The court did not merely collapse, it imploded, leaving a chasm of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ceased, but the healing that had not even begun. Salem was a village forever changed, haunted not by specters, but by the specter of its own guilt. What began with the sickness of a few girls had erupted into a communal act of self-destruction, tearing families asunder, ruining reputations, and ending innocent lives. Now the survivors were left to navigate the ruins. Neighbors once close could no longer meet each other's gaze. Those who once knelt in prayer together had turned against one another in court. The gallows stood silent, the jails were emptied, but peace was a distant dream for Salem. Some of the afflicted girls slipped away from the town as quietly as shadows at dusk. Others simply vanished into obscurity, their names whispered no more. Yet a few, like Ann Putnam Jr., would eventually bow their heads in regret. In a poignant moment of 1706, she stood before her congregation, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. She blamed her actions on the delusions wrought by Satan, seeking forgiveness for her part in the harrowing trials. But for many, the wounds inflicted were too deep for mere words to heal. The court officials, burdened by their own roles, also carried the heavy yoke of guilt. Judge Samuel Sewell, a towering figure in the trials, took a step that was as rare as it was courageous. In 1697, during a solemn church service, he stood his heart bared as a minister read aloud his confession and prayer for absolution. It was a stark moment of accountability in an era where most sought to erase the past. Yet forgetting was a luxury few could afford. The families of the condemned, their hearts heavy with loss, began to clamor for justice. Petitions cascaded into the Massachusetts government, each one a desperate plea for official pardons, for the return of seized property, for acknowledgement that those executed were innocent souls. The government, moved by the relentless cries, responded in 1711. They passed a bill to restore the rights and reputations of some victims and offered a token of financial restitution to their heirs. But this gesture was not all-encompassing. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, remained in the shadows of injustice. Whispers of witchcraft continued to echo through New England, but in Salem, the shame had woven itself into the very fabric of the town's identity. The village, in an attempt to shed its notorious past, renamed itself Danvers. Gallows Hill, where so many met their end, was left unmarked, as if the town wished to erase not just the dead, but the memory of its own dark deeds. Yet the memory lived on in sermons, in tales told by the fireside, in the heavy silence that hung between former friends. Salem had not been cursed by witches. No, it was fear, pride, and unchecked power that cast the long shadow over the town. And this curse, this legacy of sorrow, would not fade with time, but would linger, a testament to the human heart's capacity for both cruelty and remorse. Following the cessation of the executions, the echoes of the Salem witch trials still reverberate, not merely as entries in history books or as stops on educational tours, but as profound lessons in our collective understanding of justice, fear, and the delicate nature of truth. The events of 1692 were not merely a bizarre chapter of collective madness. They represented a catastrophic failure of reason, empathy, and legal fairness when gripped by panic. Ordinary citizens, farmers, midwives, ministers, transformed into executioners, swayed by hasty belief and a reluctance to question. Courts established to shield the innocent morphed into instruments of tyranny. Religion was wielded like a weapon. Testimonies turned into performances, and silence was equated with guilt. One of the most spine-chilling elements of Salem's sorrow was the swiftness with which it all unraveled. Within mere months, fear eclipsed fact. Ancient animosities, masquerading as divine conflicts, dictated death sentences. No demons or devils were necessary, only the belief in their existence. Yet from this dark chapter emerged invaluable lessons influencing American society for generations. In the subsequent years and centuries, the Salem incident was invoked time and again in discussions about due process and civil rights. The U.S. Constitution, crafted nearly a century later, explicitly banned practices like ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, which had effectively sealed the fate of the accused in Salem. The assurance of legal counsel, the right to confront one's accusers, and the necessity for solid evidence became hard-won principles partly forged from the ashes of Gallows Hill. In contemporary discourse, the term witch hunt has become a metaphor for political vendettas or moral panics, often stripped of the true horror it signifies. Indeed, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a community where individuals were executed for non-existent crimes betrayed by the very systems meant to safeguard them. How could a society so quickly abandon its core values? What does it say about human nature when fear trumps reason? These questions, born from the heart of Salem, continue to challenge and shape our understanding of justice and truth. In this chapter of our story, we must pause to reflect on a sobering truth. Fear, when left unchecked, can morph into its own form of tyranny. Imagine a world where fear is not just a fleeting emotion, but is sanctioned by those in power, be it through courts, churches, or governments. This fear becomes a relentless force, nearly unstoppable. The Salem witch trials serve as a haunting reminder, a chilling narrative not merely of a village's plunge into insanity, but of how swiftly reason can crumble when fear is crowned with authority. The scaffolds might have vanished, the courtroom silenced, but the stark warning persists. Truth is delicate. Justice does not spring forth effortlessly, and history, with its cruel repetition, demands our remembrance. Now let us turn to Fulvia, born around 83 BC, into the Fulvi family, an elite yet peculiar clan that had ascended from plebeian roots to the upper crust of Roman politics. Though not one of the ancient patrician families, the Fulvi were renowned for producing consuls generals and eloquent orators. Their lineage was steeped in ambition and a penchant for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was more infamous for his stuttering speech than his political acumen, earning him the nickname Bambalio. But Fulvia, she was the antithesis of a stammer. She was destined to lead. From her earliest years, Fulvia was immersed in the cutthroat realm of Roman power. Senators and generals would convene in her home, their debates echoing through the halls. The world of politics was not confined to the forum. It infiltrated marriages, funerals, whispers, and clandestine deals. Women in such elite Roman circles were traditionally expected to be silent, refined, educated, and subservient. But Fulvia, she shattered these expectations. Wealthy, highly educated, and with connections that spanned the empire, she was acutely aware of her own potential. Her early life, though, shrouded in the mists of history, hints at a young woman who was not just an observer, but a student of the political game, literate in its language and fearless in its execution. What kind of legacy would such a woman forge? How would her presence reshape the contours of Roman history? Fulvia's story is not just a tale of personal ambition, but a testament to the power of an individual's will against the backdrop of societal norms. Fulvia was no wallflower content to blend into the shadows. She possessed a formidable presence, a keen political acumen, and an unyielding resolve to assert herself even within the male-dominated sphere of Roman governance. 107. This era was marked by unparalleled turmoil. The very fabric of the Republic was fraying at the edges. Civil wars erupted, populist uprisings surged, and the power struggles among generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar transformed Rome into a volatile crucible. The ancient codes were crumbling, and Fulvia, coming of age amidst this chaos, did not shy away. Instead, she learned to harness it. Her upbringing was far from nurturing the demure matron Rome so often revered. It forged a woman who viewed politics not as a realm to fear, but as a battleground to conquer. Fulvia would not merely marry into power, she would command legions, spearhead rebellions, and become the first Roman woman to grace coinage, not as a deity, but as herself. 259. Rome was unprepared for Fulvia, yet she was primed for Rome. Her initial union was with Publius Clodius Pulcher, a marriage as unconventional as it was strategic. Clodius was not your typical Roman noble. He was a firebrand, a political provocateur with a penchant for chaos, scandal, and grassroots power. To the patricians, he was a menace. To the plebeians, a savior. To Fulvia, he represented a tactical alliance. Their matrimony sometime in the early 50s BCE aligned her with the man who had made the Roman Republic his own theater. Clodius was notorious for his audacious flouting of norms. He had once donned women's attire to sneak into a sacred female-only religious ritual at Caesar's residence. 103-48. Such scandalous antics. Could one imagine the uproar, the whispers, the sheer audacity Fulvia in her youth must have watched with a mixture of awe and calculation, seeing in Clodius not just a husband, but a gateway to influence and upheaval. Caius's charisma and defiance only seemed to ignite the public's admiration. He boldly relinquished his patrician privileges to vie for the tribunate of the plebs, an influential position granting veto power over the Senate. Caius was no stranger to Rome's gritty street politics, and Fulvia, far from being merely decorative, stood steadfastly by his side. She was no mere observer, but an active participant, her voice as loud as his. Roman records whisper of Fulvia's deep involvement in her husband's political sphere, mingling with supporters, spearheading his campaigns, and transforming their home into a nexus of Caius's political maneuvers. Together, they epitomized a revolutionary Roman power duo, daring populist and unabashedly confrontational. Yet such alliances exacted a toll. In the fateful year of 52 BCE, Caius met his demise on the Appian Way, felled by the henchmen of his rival, Titus Annus Milo. His death was not just a tragedy, but a catalyst for chaos, sending tremors through the very foundations of Rome. But Fulvia, far from succumbing to quiet mourning, orchestrated a spectacle of a funeral that still echoes through the annals of history. She paraded Claeus's battered corpse through the forum, his wounds stark and unhidden, a macabre display designed to stir the deepest emotions. The public, struck by horror and fury, erupted. The Senate House itself was consumed by flames, a testament to the power of Fulvia's grief-fueled strategy. She had masterfully converted personal loss into a public uprising. This was her inaugural significant political maneuver, and it succeeded spectacularly. Her prowess in manipulating public sentiment, her strategic use of spectacle, and her ability to leverage her husband's legacy as a formidable weapon marked her as a new breed of political figure in Rome. Claeus was no more, but Fulvia emerged from the shadows, her presence forever altering the political landscape. She did not wallow in her sorrow. In Rome, political influence was fleeting, and Fulvia, with a keen understanding of this reality, swiftly moved on. Not long after Claeus's violent end, she entered into matrimony once again, this time with Gaius Scribonius Curio, a man whose political ambitions would soon intertwine with her own. In the tempestuous world of Roman politics, where ambition and drama often intertwined, Curio shone as a beacon of flamboyance and strategic acumen. 10558. At first glance, his pairing with Fulvia might have seemed as unlikely as a rose blooming in the Colosseum's dust. Yet beneath his theatrical exterior, Curio was a master of the political game. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, he held sway over Rome during a time when the very fabric of the Republic frayed under the strain of Caesar's soaring aspirations and the Senate's staunch opposition. Verses 0624. For Fulvia, Curio was not merely a new husband. He was a crucial link to the next echelon of power. This was not a mere rebound of the heart, but a meticulously orchestrated alliance. With Claeus gone, Fulvia required a new political fulcrum, a figure who could not only continue the populist legacy, but also enjoyed Caesar's favor. Curio was the perfect fit. 0648. Through this union, Fulvia did not merely align herself with a movement. She became an architect of its evolution. She kept Claeus's followers galvanized, reimagining their cause under Curio's banner, ensuring the urban populace remained politically vibrant. 708. But as Rome teetered on the brink of chaos, the tensions between Caesar and Pompey erupted into civil war. Curio, with his characteristic zeal, committed to Caesar's cause, plunging into the fray with all his might. Fulvia, ever the political strategist, was not idle. She reportedly played a pivotal role in marshaling support and managing resources for her husband's campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio embarked on a daring military expedition to Africa, aiming to solidify Caesar's position. Alas, fate dealt a cruel hand. 10737. Ambushed by the forces of King Juba of Numidia, Curio met a tragic end. His army obliterated, his vision shattered. Once more, Fulvia stood widowed, the echoes of loss reverberating through her resolve. Yet Rome watched with bated breath, wondering if this indomitable woman would retreat into obscurity. She did not. Curio's death only cemented her reputation as a political widow of formidable resilience. 10759. She had now lost two husbands, yet her spirit remained unbroken, her influence undiminished. Oh, the tumultuous times of Rome's civil unrest. The echoes of two husbands lost to the fervor of populist causes still lingered in the air, but Fulvia, ever the indomitable spirit, was far from vanquished. Her most daring alliance, her most electrifying act was yet to unfold. Enter Mark Antony. The ambitious general, the steadfast comrade of Julius Caesar, whose heart and ambitions intertwined with Fulvia's in a union forged around 47 BCE. This was not merely a bond of love, but a powerful coalition, a merger of might and cunning. Fulvia, already a virtuoso in the art of Roman street politics, brought to Antony the savvy he desperately needed in the serpentine world of Roman politics. Together they became one of the most formidable couples in the annals of the late Republic. By the time they wed, Fulvia had danced with death in deceit, outsmarting countless adversaries and mourning the loss of two husbands. Antony, too, was no stranger to the tempest of scandal, his life a whirlwind of drink dice and disarray. Yet in Fulvia, he found not just a companion, but a strategist, a guardian of his interests, a beacon for his supporters when he was away on distant campaigns. Imagine, dear reader, a woman like Fulvia who did not just stand beside her man, but wielded power with a boldness that Rome had seldom seen. She delved into his correspondence, issued commands when he was absent, sat in on councils, and shaped the destinies of men. How could this not unsettle the traditionalists? To them, she was overbearing, insatiable in her quest for power. But what truly rattled their cages was not merely her ambition. It was that she maneuvered in the arena like a Roman man in a time when such a role for a woman was unthinkable. After the brutal assassination of Caesar in 44 BCE, Rome once again spiraled into chaos. Antony, in a race against time, sought to cement his status as Caesar's political heir. But it was Fulvia, with her unparalleled acumen and audacity, who stood poised to turn the tides. The heart of Rome, where power was not just a game, but a spectacle. While Mark Antony was out weaving his political threads across the vast expanse of the Roman world, Fulvia, his indomitable wife, held the city in her iron grip. Imagine her not as a mere consort, but as the very embodiment of Antony's presence, the sentinel of his power in the capital. Fulvia, with the cunning of a seasoned statesman, navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics. She was not just Antony's wife, she was his shadow, his voice, his hand. She maneuvered through the labyrinthine streets of Rome, her influence palpable in every dark alley and bustling forum. Coins were struck not just with Antony's visage, but with her name inscribed alongside a bold declaration of her status, a testament to her undeniable role in the political theater of Rome. How did she manage it? With a blend of charm and ruthlessness, she coordinated with the street gangs, the lifeblood of urban control, ensuring Antony's supporters remained not just loyal, but fervently so. She was the architect of his alliances, even arranging a marriage between her daughter Clodia and Octavian, a move that was as strategic as it was personal, a bond that would later unravel with dramatic flair. In a time when power was as fluid as the Tiber, Fulvia anchored Antony's authority with her sheer force of will. She was not content to linger in the shadows. She stood under the harsh, revealing light of Roman politics. Here was a woman who did not just play the game, she redefined it. While Antony chased glory and empire, Fulvia held Rome itself in her palm, directing allies, managing the plebs, and most audaciously waging war with nothing but her wit and her wealth. She financed troops, ensured public order through bribes, and maneuvered legislation to favor Antony's future. How did the ancient sources see her as manipulative, perhaps, or even as a warmonger? But these labels barely scratch the surface of a woman who, in a world of men, played the game of politics with a master's touch. Fulvia was not just playing, she was changing the rules. In Rome, that ancient stage watched with bated breath to see how far she could go before the city's fickle heart would rebel against such audacity. In a world where women were expected to confine themselves to the art of weaving and the sorrow of mourning, Fulvia was not content to merely exist within these confines. She was forging alliances, championing military leaders, and even issuing edicts, roles traditionally reserved for the male senators and consuls of Rome. Imagine the scene: Fulvia, with her commanding presence, making public appearances and nurturing bonds with the seasoned soldiers, a group crucial to the political machinations of the fading republic. While Antony was off campaigning in the East, Fulvia became the emblem of his power in Italy. She met with centurions, swayed decisions on land distribution, and ensured that the soldiers remembered their allegiance to Antony was not without its rewards. Yet with every step she took, the weight of her influence grew heavier. The Roman aristocracy, especially those aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's increasingly bitter rivals, seethed at Fulvia's encroachment. They saw her not just as an interfering woman, but as a dangerous anomaly wielding power over legions, laws, and loyalties without the shield of male guardianship. Fulvia was no fool. She recognized the escalating tension between Antony and Octavian. She could feel the cracks in their alliance widening. Understanding something profound, that perhaps even they did not fully comprehend. The Republic could not sustain the ambitions of both men. Thus she began to prepare not for peace, but for battle. She had long stood in the shadow of power, but now Fulvia was poised to seize it for herself. In 41 BCE, she did what was unimaginable. She declared war on Octavian, the man who would become Augustus, and she did not do so timidly. With Antony still in the east, Fulvia, alongside Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother, and a consul, boldly contested Octavian's authority in Italy. Why, you might ask? Officially, it was to safeguard Antony's interests and to uphold the land rights of the Roman veterans who had sworn loyalty to him. Beneath the surface of this historical tumult, Fulvia's influence was palpable, her fingerprints indelibly marking every aspect of the unfolding drama. This was no mere political skirmish. It was a military rebellion masterminded by a Roman woman. Imagine the audacity, the sheer defiance of tradition. This was the first and indeed the only time in Roman history that a woman would actively stir and orchestrate a civil war. The conflict, infamously dubbed the Parucine War, erupted due to Octavian's contentious land redistribution scheme, which uprooted countless Italians to placate his loyal legionaries. Fulvia, with the cunning of a seasoned strategist, capitalized on the simmering resentment. She painted Octavian as a despotic betrayer of Caesar's sacred legacy. With Lucius as her public face in the Senate and herself pulling the strings from the shadows, they rallied 8 legions, capturing Perusia, now known as Perugia. This was unequivocally Fulvia's war. Ancient chronicles hint that her fervor for the conflict surpassed even Lucius's. She mobilized troops, ignited the populace, and engaged in correspondence with generals. Rumors swirled through Rome of Fulvia commanding legions, issuing decrees, and compelling Lucius into battles he sought to avoid. Yet Octavian, though taken aback, was swift in his response. He laid siege to Perugia through the harsh winter of 41 to 40 BCE, severing its lifelines, relentlessly pounding the city into submission. As Fulvia found herself ensnared between starvation and political deceit, her audacious venture began to crumble. By early 40 BCE, Perugia capitulated. Lucius Antonius was spared, perhaps, to maintain some semblance of peace with Antony, but Fulvia was banished. The woman who had once swayed riots, marriages, armies, and the very will of the public was now deemed too perilous for Roman soil. Exiled to Sicyon in Greece, she harbored hopes of reuniting with Antony, but he did not hasten to her side. The once formidable bond between husband and wife had dissolved amidst the chaos of war and the vastness of distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his consent. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had before waged war, not just with words, but with legions. In the aftermath of a civil war, Rome had exacted its retribution. Banished from her homeland, Fulvia found herself in Sicyon, a Greek city that had morphed into a limbo for those whose political fortunes had faltered. This was no sanctuary for the weary, but a shadowy corner where the once powerful were left to contemplate their fall from grace. She had waged war not for personal glory, but in defense of her husband's name. She believed she was safeguarding Mark Antony's interests, his honor, perhaps even their collective dream of Rome. Yet what greeted her in exile was not the laurels of a hero, but a deafening silence. Fulvia had gambled everything, her status, her alliances, her very life. And yet where was Antony in her hour of need? By the time she reached Greece, he was already ensnared by Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romance had blossomed or was merely budding, the imagery was devastating. Here was Fulvia mustering legions, while Antony was toasting with goblets beside a queen. The betrayal was not merely personal, it was a political knife twist. She had fought to secure Antony's power in Italy, and he in turn left her to wither. Historians, particularly Plutarch, suggest Antony's wrath stemmed from Fulvia's unauthorized initiation of the Parucine War. Others whisper he perhaps relished her downfall, which conveniently paved the way for an alliance with Octavian, an alliance Fulvia would have fiercely opposed. Yet not all abandoned her. Some of Antony's loyal troops, their hearts still true to her, pleaded for reconciliation. But time was not on her side. The toll of siege exile and betrayal weighed heavily on Fulvia. In Sicyon, around 40 BCE, she succumbed perhaps to illness or the crushing weight of heartbreak or both. At about 43 years old, her life extinguished. Antony found in her death a political reprieve. Soon after, he convened with Octavian, sealing a marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia, thus ensuring a strategic union that would reshape the political landscape of Rome. The fragile peace treaty. The triumvirate, once again a fleeting unity, found themselves bound not by shared vision, but by the absence of Fulvia, the audacious woman who dared to challenge their very essence. Verse 18 to 30. While Cleopatra's shadow would soon eclipse Fulvia's memory, let us not forget that Fulvia was the trailblazer, the archetype of female power in a world where women were often relegated to the shadows. She did not whisper commands from behind a veil. No, she strode boldly into the heart of power, stood tall, and commanded legions with the authority of a Roman man. Rome, bewildered and threatened by her presence, chose to erase her from its annals. Verse 18 to 53. Yet the embers of her defiance smoldered on her tail, anything but mundane. Following her demise in 40 BC, the men she once outplayed, Antony, Octavian, and even her erstwhile allies, began the insidious task of reshaping her legacy. Unable to speak for herself, Fulvia's story was molded by those who feared her ambition, her enemies, and the uneasy beneficiaries of her downfall. Like many formidable women in history, she was cast as the scapegoat, or 1925 ancient texts, predominantly scribed by men with agendas, portrayed her as the instigator of the Perusian War, the catalyst for the rift between Antony and Octavian, and the very embodiment of the Republic's turmoil. Appian, Dio, and Plutarch painted her as overbearing, consumed by jealousy, and driven by a voracious desire for power. They accused her of leading Lucius Antonius astray, provoking Octavian, and even estranging Antony from Rome. 1956. But were these judgments just far from it? Fulvia navigated a political landscape where aggression and cunning were not just tolerated but expected, provided you were a man. Her ambition was no greater than Caesar's, her assertiveness no more than Pompey's, and her ruthlessness paled in comparison to the later deeds of Octavian. Her true sin, she was a woman daring to tread the path of Roman men. Rome was at a loss, utterly bewildered by the enigma that was Fulvia, or 2022. She wasn't confined to the domestic sphere, weaving in silence or adorning political landscapes as mere decoration. No, she was penning letters to generals, rallying the masses, and commanding the unwavering loyalty of her troops. This made her not just a threat to Octavian, but to the very fabric of history itself. Even Mark Antony, whose legacy she had so fiercely defended, found it all too convenient to scapegoat her for the turmoil. 48. After patching things up with Octavian and tying the knot with his sister Antony, used Fulvia's demise as a political ploy, a cleansing ritual for his own ambitions. Her memory, the essence of her being, was bartered away for his survival. No grand tributes, no solemn processions, no eloquent eulogies in the Senate, just a deafening silence. Yet her adversaries couldn't completely obliterate her from existence. Fulvia had accomplished far too much. 121 and 12. She had raised legions of manipulated elections, forged alliances, and waged a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name was etched on coinage, not as a goddess or an allegory, but as a force in her own right. The tarnishing of her image was calculated, yet her presence in history was equally deliberate. Here's 21 and 34. Despite the concerted efforts to bury her under layers of caricature and defamation, Fulvia's spirit refused to fade. Her defiance still reverberates. You only need to tune out the male voices to hear her. Fulvia's tale might conclude in silence, but her legacy, it resonates with the force of a storm. In the epics following her death, scholars and scribes grappled with fitting her into Rome's epic tale, for Fulvia shattered all conventions of what a Roman woman should embody. 122. Hero 2. She didn't merely whisper counsel from behind the scenes. She seized power, becoming its very embodiment, making her both indelible and profoundly disturbing to a world ruled by men. In a culture where women were supposed to wield influence through hushed words and marital alliances, Fulvia roared through policy warfare and the grand spectacle of politics. She was no mere consort. She was not just any commander. 22, 26. No, she was a beacon of defiance, her legacy far outshining her military exploits. Roman historians, those keepers of the past, were ill-equipped to deal with a woman who refused the confines of her expected role. They painted her as shrill, power-hungry, a disruptor of peace. But delve deeper, look beyond their words, and behold a different portrait. Fulvia the Trailblazer was the first Roman woman to etch her name into the very currency of Rome, March 22, 47. She didn't merely participate in politics. She orchestrated factions, wielded marriage as a strategic tool, and navigated the tumultuous street politics of Rome with a deftness that was nothing short of breathtaking. She did not merely witness the civil wars of the 1st century BCE. She was a pivotal player, her influence sending chills down the spines of senators and altering the course of history for the triumvirs in 10. Her downfall, not a lack of skill or vision, but the unfortunate intersection of timing and gender. Imagine had she been born into a different body, she might have been celebrated as a second Caesar, or perhaps a more charismatic Cato. Instead, she was vilified, labeled as the nefarious woman who dared to reach too far. Yet her spirit did not fade into obscurity. Her legacy, though whispered, was profound. Women like Livia, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, though from different realms, walked in the shadows she had helped to carve. 23-41. They would manipulate emperors, command legions, and shape the line of succession. But it was Fulvia who did it first without the shield of an imperial title. Today, modern scholars with new eyes are re-evaluating Fulvia. She is no longer just a cautionary tale, but recognized as one of the most politically astute women in Roman history. 24-03. She pushed against the boundaries of female power, paying the price, yet leaving an indelible mark. She didn't merely exist in the era of the triumvirs, she challenged them. And though Rome might have sought to erase her, Fulvia's fingerprints are on every fragment of its decline. Not merely a footnote, but a force, a woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer, in the year 1963, the United States stood at a crossroads, caught between the shadows of a past steeped in oppression and the dawn of a future yearning for liberty. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't merely a societal habit, it was the ironclad law. Here, African Americans were systematically excluded from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even the simple dignity of drinking from public fountains. Police brutality ran unchecked, lynchings persisted, and in cities like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful demonstrators faced the fierce bite of police dogs and the punishing force of high-pressure fire hoses. Yet amidst this oppression, a tide of change was surging forward, uninvited and unstoppable. Within just a few years, the civil rights movement had burst onto the national stage. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become the rallying cries of the era. Names like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer mere whispers. They had become beacons of resistance. The March on Washington did not spring from a fleeting moment of inspiration. It was the culmination of mounting frustration and an unquenchable hope. Black Americans were no longer willing to wait. They were demanding their civil rights, their voices echoing across the nation, seeking to be heard in the very heart of America's power, Washington, D.C. The concept of a grand march in the Capitol had been a dream deferred for decades. Philip Randolph, a seasoned labor organizer and civil rights stalwart, had initially floated the idea back in the 1940s. His aim then was to compel the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was averted, when Roosevelt relented, signing an executive order. But by 1963, the stakes had escalated. Randolph, alongside luminaries like Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., breathed new life into this vision. This time their march was not just for jobs. It was a march for dignity, for the right to vote, for the integration of schools, for equal compensation. The call was clear, the time for change had come, and it was time to march. And above all else, for the fundamental human right to live unencumbered by fear. 2637. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations, despite their numerous disagreements, came together. They understood the immense power that unity could wield. The countdown had commenced. Buses were being organized, flyers circulated like wildfire, and word of mouth outran the speed of newspapers. Across the nation, Black Americans were gearing up for what was to become an indelible chapter in American history. 12704, the dream was materializing with each determined step. Orchestrating any protest in Washington, D.C. was no trifling matter, but to plan for over 100,000 people, perhaps more. It was sheer madness. The logistics alone were daunting. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, restrooms, medical teams, permits, managing the crowd, ensuring safety. 127 and 27, yet against all odds, they pulled it off. At the heart of this whirlwind of activity was Bayard Rustin, a man whose open homosexuality often relegated him to the shadows for political expediency, yet he was the master strategist. Rustin, having studied nonviolence under Mahatma Gandhi's disciples in India, had marched, been jailed, beaten, and watched by the FBI. But nothing could shake his resolve. 12755. He viewed the March on Washington as an opportunity to demonstrate to the world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when executed with military precision. In a mere 8 weeks, Rustin and his team turned an idea into a monumental event. Officially titled the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, it was meticulously crafted to encompass both racial justice and economic opportunity. 28 This dual message was no mere coincidence. While Dr. King would later emerge as the spiritual emblem of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who ensured the demands echoed the cries for employment, minimum wages, and justice. Imagine a nation coming together, hearts pounding in unison, voices rising in a chorus for change. Could there be a more powerful testament to the spirit of unity and the pursuit of justice? The struggle for fair wages and workers' rights was as fervently fought as the battle for civil rights. Beneath the surface, tensions brewed like a storm waiting to break. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were on edge, their nerves frayed by the fear of riots, backlash, or even bloodshed. Yet civil rights leaders with a calm resolve promised a peaceful protest. Despite their assurances, the National Guard stood ready. Hospitals in D.C. were braced for emergencies, and liquor sales were forbidden on that day. Even federal workers were given the option to stay home, a silent acknowledgement of the potential upheaval. Unity, however, was not without its challenges. The Big Six civil rights organizations, the NAACP, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often found themselves at odds over strategy. Some yearned for more radical actions, while others advocated for diplomacy. The youthful vigor of SNCC was growing restless with Dr. King's steadfast commitment to nonviolence. Yet in this moment, all agreed silence was no longer an option. Bayard Rustin's plan was meticulous, almost military in its precision. Every bus, every train was accounted for. Every speaker was scheduled down to the minute. Marshals trained in crowd control were stationed along every route. They weren't merely organizing a march. They were choreographing a pivotal moment that would jolt the nation's conscience. On that sweltering Wednesday, August 28, 1963, in Washington, D.C., the heat was palpable by 9:00 a.m. The humidity like a damp embrace. But the heat did not deter them. From every corner of the country, they arrived, a mosaic of humanity. Black and white, young and old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. some dressed in their Sunday finest, others holding signs of protest. They came by bus, by train, by carpool, and on foot. Over 250,000 people, a rising tide of hope, converged on the National Mall. Yet amidst fears of chaos, there was an astonishing tranquility. Volunteers guided the throng with a quiet efficiency. Was this not a testament to the power of unity and peace? The scene was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, humanity can choose harmony over discord. As the sun climbed higher, volunteers from the Red Cross handed out water, their hands a lifeline in the warm Washington air. Groups burst into song, their voices rising in freedom anthems, hands clasped in unity, and cheers erupting with each new arrival. The sound of gospel choirs near the reflecting pool melded with the fervent chants for jobs and freedom, reverberating against the stoic marble of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities like Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan joined the throng not for fame but to bear witness to a pivotal moment in history, their presence a testament to the quiz greater than themselves. The crowd, a sea of orderly yet electric energy, moved with purpose, not a single shove theft or act of violence in sight. This was no ordinary protest. It was a sacred gathering, a profound act of revolution for many Black Americans. To stand on the Mall, to be visible, to be counted in the shadow of the great emancipator, was a moment of profound significance, a culmination of generations of struggle and hope. At noon, the official proceedings commenced. Leaders ascended the stage, each a beacon from different organizations, ideologies, and regions, yet all echoing the same message of unity and change. They called for equal pay, the end to segregated schools, a living wage, and an end to the scourge of police brutality. Mahalia Jackson's voice soared, and Marian Anderson, once barred from Constitution Hall, due to her race, now sang freely under the vast sky, her voice a symbol of progress. As the day wore on, the atmosphere thickened, not with discord, but with a palpable anticipation. The crowd hushed, awaited the moment when the man they all came to hear would speak. The march was not just etching its name into history, it was becoming the stuff of legends with every passing second. By mid-afternoon, the crowd's silence was not from fatigue, but from the collective breath held in anticipation of what was to come. In the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, an aura of anticipation hung heavy in the air. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped forward, his silhouette framed against the backdrop of a monument dedicated to freedom. Clad in a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his demeanor exuded a serene determination that only thinly veiled the fervor burning within. He approached the podium, notes in hand, meticulously crafted the previous night in collaboration with his advisors. Yet it was not the scripted words that would etch themselves into the annals of history. As he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of unfulfilled promises, of segregation's bitter sting, and the harshness of police brutality. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he intoned his voice, oscillating with the cadence of a preacher, "The Negro is still not free." His words, punctuated by pauses that were as telling as the spoken, resonated with the crowd. Some nodded in solemn agreement. Others dabbed at their eyes, moved by the stark truth of his words, while signs simply proclaiming "now" bobbed in the sea of people. But then a pivotal moment unfolded. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel luminary who had graced the stage earlier, called out from behind him, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And Dr. King, inspired by her urging, cast aside his prepared speech. Clasping the podium with newfound vigor, he spoke from his soul. "I have a dream," he declared, and the crowd, as if pulled by an invisible force, leaned closer. "I have a dream," his voice now a clarion call, "that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each subsequent phrase seemed to gain momentum, echoing louder, clearer, more defiantly. "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down together at the table of brotherhood." His vision, so vividly painted, not only captured the hearts of those present, but also ignited a flame of hope that would illuminate the path toward justice and equality. Imagine a world where four little children, their futures bright and boundless, will one day live in a nation that sees beyond the hue of their skin to the essence of their character. This wasn't just a speech. It was a vision, a fervent prayer, a bolt of lightning that pierced through the fabric of history. When Martin Luther King Jr. concluded with those stirring words, free at last, thank God Almighty we are free at last," the crowd erupted. Applause thundered, tears flowed freely, and shouts of joy pierced the air. They knew, they felt in their very souls that they had witnessed something far greater than mere oratory. They had heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't confined to the eloquence of speeches or the melodies of music alone. It was the people themselves. The sheer magnitude of humanity gathered was staggering. They came from every corner of the country, from the cotton fields of Mississippi to the skyscrapers of New York, from the vineyards of California to the bustling factories of Michigan. Among them were seasoned activists, their feet worn from countless marches, and others for whom this was their first journey beyond their hometown's borders. They carried homemade lunches, endured over 20 hours on buses, and slept in their Sunday best, just to be part of this historic moment. Ordinary people, they were maids, teachers, steel workers, postal clerks. Yet they saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses to history. They didn't merely seek change, they embodied it. And there were children in this sea of humanity. Young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys clutching signs they'd drawn themselves. Parents lifted toddlers onto their shoulders, allowing them a glimpse of the distant Lincoln Memorial, their ears filled with the voices echoing through loudspeakers. For these young souls, this was not just an event. It was the dawn of a new era. Among the crowd faces stood out none more so than a young John Lewis, only 23, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. His speech, initially so fiery, so unyielding, had been moderated by senior leaders. But his passion remained undimmed, a beacon of the youth's unyielding spirit for justice and equality. With only minutes to spare before his moment on stage, he consented, albeit with great reluctance. Yet his impassioned plea for radical transformation reverberated through the crowd, stirring their hearts and minds. And then there was Daisy Bates, the sole woman to grace the stage that day. She did not speak for herself, but instead delivered a poignant message on behalf of countless other civil rights women. The organizers, criticized for marginalizing female voices, had given her this platform. Her concise yet resonant words laid bare a bitter truth. Even in a movement championing equality, some voices still fought to be acknowledged. The assembly was a melting pot of union leaders, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students from diverse walks of life. Not all were aligned in their methods. Some embraced Dr. King's doctrine of nonviolence, while others were drawn to Malcolm X's more aggressive stance. But on this singular day, such differences were set aside. Unity prevailed. It was a visual symphony of American potential, where white and black hands clasped in solidarity and "Freedom Now" buttons adorned countless chests. The crowd, a sea of 250,000 souls, breathed as one, not merely witnessing history, but actively molding it. Their faces, etched with determination and hope, would forever remember the spectacle they beheld. While the world witnessed unity, inspiration, and poetic justice unfold on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the reality behind the scenes of the March on Washington was far from straightforward. What appeared as a well-orchestrated movement was in fact a delicate balance of logistics, sweat, and last-minute compromises. Bayard Rustin, the mastermind behind the event, navigated not only the logistical labyrinth, but also the treacherous waters of politics. He was under constant scrutiny, not only for being openly gay and a former communist, but also because some feared his identity could tarnish the movement's image. Indeed, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of a personal relationship, a scandal that could have unraveled the fabric of their collective efforts. Had King not removed Rustin from an earlier campaign, the specter of that decision would have cast a long shadow over every planning phase. And what of the women's voices, those unsung heroines whose roles were pivotal, yet whose presence at the podium remained conspicuously absent? Despite the monumental contributions of Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, they were not granted the stage to speak on their own. Worship 3909. Imagine Rosa Parks, an icon, was there among the throng revered by all, yet not given the chance to wield the microphone. The visual grandeur of the march belied the underlying complexities. The movement, with all its fervor, still wrestled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. Within the circle of the Big Six organizations, tension simmered like a pot on the verge of boiling over. SNCC leaders, their patience wearing thin, were increasingly at odds with the older generation's call for moderation. They yearned to attack systemic racism head-on, to uproot it with fierce determination. Corps shared these frustrations, yet the imperative of unity for this single day held them in check. During 39 and 36. Meanwhile, the federal government observed with bated breath. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, in its relentless vigilance, had dispatched over 100 agents to shadow the organizers. They infiltrated hotel rooms, tailed key figures, and amassed dossiers. 140. Convinced that violence or communist subversion was imminent, they doubled their efforts when the day passed without incident, focusing particularly on Dr. King. And money, the march was not cheap. Over $250,000 was needed, a sum that would translate to millions in today's currency. Most funds were secured through unions and compassionate donors, but the organizers were scrambling until the very last moment. 27. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was indeed historic, but it was also profoundly human-flawed, tangled in politics and still in progress, much like the nation it aimed to mend. As the sun began its descent behind the Washington Monument, the crowds lingered, embracing, weeping, singing, each person reluctant to part from the transformative energy of the day. 4051. The hallowed ground still held the whispers of the march's final steps, its essence lingering in the air like an indelible mark of history. Yet as the last orator stepped down, the signs were lowered and the world turned its gaze away. A poignant question emerged, thick and palpable in the late August humidity. What comes next? In the days that followed, the media's response was a mix of awe and skepticism. Major publications acknowledged the monumental nature of the event, yet their coverage often carried a tone of distant observation. They described it as orderly, perhaps a coded relief that chaos did not ensue. Yet the heart of the march's demands, the urgent call for federal jobs or a living wage that would equate to 20 today, found little resonance in the ink of their columns. However, the spotlight shone unfalteringly on Dr. King's speech, its impact undeniable, its words echoing like a clarion call that could not be silenced. Even President John F. Kennedy, once wary of the march, watched with a mixture of admiration and perhaps astonishment as the event unfolded on his television screen. He declared it impressive and soon after met with civil rights leaders at the White House. Yet the wheels of legislation turned with agonizing slowness, his proposed Civil Rights Act ensnared in the thorny grip of Southern opposition. Disappointment shadowed some activists who had envisioned the march as a catalyst for immediate change. Instead, they found themselves back in the trenches, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who had sacrificed everything for justice. The stark reality struck just weeks later on September 15, 1963, when the cruel hand of hatred snuffed out the lives of 4 young black girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been articulated, yes, but the nightmare of racial injustice persisted. Still, an undeniable shift had occurred. The March on Washington heralded a new era for the civil rights movement, demonstrating that disciplined, massive protest could not only be heard, but could also be a formidable force impossible to overlook. It forged an alliance wider and stronger than ever before, uniting not just voices, but the very heartbeats of a nation in the relentless pursuit of equality. In an extraordinary gathering of spirits, the March on Washington brought together union members, faith leaders, celebrity students, and the working class of America all in one place, bound by a common pursuit of justice. It wasn't just an event. It was a symphony of voices, a crescendo of unity that gave the movement its voice. A dream was shared, a speech delivered that would resonate, be dissected, and celebrated around the globe. As the march concluded, the real journey was just beginning. The path ahead promised to be fraught with challenges marked by blood legislation and profound transformation. This march didn't merely shake the moral compass of America, it remapped its ethical terrain. What started as a daring protest became a pivotal chapter in the civil rights movement's story, forever changing the American perception of justice, democracy, and the potency of united action. Legislatively, the immediate aftermath did not yield swift victories, but the momentum was palpable. Less than a year later, in the heat of July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act, a monumental piece of legislation that outlawed segregation in public spaces and employment and discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Following this, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, delivering a direct blow to the oppressive Jim Crow laws. Could these transformative laws have come to pass without the March on Washington? Perhaps, yet would they have carried the same moral weight, the same irrefutable public demand? Unlikely. For Martin Luther King Jr., that day's speech launched him into an orbit of global recognition, transforming him from a respected leader into a revered icon. However, this fame was not without its burdens, surveillance threats, and ultimately his assassination in 1968. The dream he articulated from those hallowed steps grew only more poignant, tragic, and cherished as the years passed. For the wider movement, the march demonstrated the heights that unity could reach. It provided a roadmap for mass mobilization, inspiring a new wave of activists, not just in the U.S., but around the world. What of the future? Would the echoes of this unity inspire further change in South Africa in student protests? The legacy of the march was not just in what it achieved, but in the enduring question it left us with. If we can come together, once can we not do so again and again for justice? In Europe and around the world, future champions of human rights look back to that pivotal day in 1963 as a beacon of inspiration. Yet the legacy of the March on Washington transcends mere history. It vibrates with life, pulsing through the veins of contemporary activism. The very language of the march, those impassioned cries for gays and freedom, the visual poetry of peaceful resistance, and the reverberating echoes of "I Have a Dream," all continue to stir the soul of modern protest. From the solemnity of the Million-Man March to the fervent energy of Black Lives Matter rallies, the spirit of '63 resounds with each chant in every cardboard sign hoisted high in Washington, D.C. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s memorial now stands sentinel across the tidal basin, a stone's throw from the Lincoln Memorial where he once spoke. Here, visitors tread by his monumental figure, words from that August day chiseled into the granite. But let us not be fooled by the cold touch of stone. The true monument to King's legacy is not in the stillness of marble. It thrives in the fervor of classrooms, where his words are taught in the sanctity of voting booths, in the cadence of marches, and in the persistent voices that refuse the silence of complacency. The dream was never intended to be archived in history books. It was meant to be lived out, breathed in every day. Over 6 decades have slipped by since that summer afternoon when a sea of over 250,000 souls gathered shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of Lincoln's monument. The March on Washington has been enshrined in textbooks, captured in documentaries, and displayed in museum halls. Dr. King's speech, his voice unwavering and resonant, remains a sacred echo in our national consciousness. But amidst the accolades and memorials, a poignant question lingers. Has the dream been realized, or has it merely been deferred? In some respects, progress is undeniable. The legal shackles of segregation have been broken. Voting rights, though, now facing renewed challenges, were hard-won through sacrifice, through marches, through legal battles. The presence of Black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unimaginable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once outlawed across swathes of the country, is now safeguarded by federal law. Yet as we stand at this crossroads, we must ask ourselves, are we merely content with the milestones? Or do we dare to keep pushing the boundaries of what was once thought impossible? These victories born from unyielding struggle are not trivial. Yet the original demands of that historic march, often eclipsed by King's eloquent speech, continue to reverberate through the corridors of time, still seeking resolution. The plea for a living wage, for instance, lingers unfulfilled. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare persist like deep-rooted vines strangling the dreams of equality. Police brutality, the very spark that ignited much of the early civil rights activism, still fuels the flames of outrage and protest. The vision of true economic justice, where opportunity does not bow to the dictates of zip code or skin color, remains a distant horizon. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have shouldered the torch, drawing inspiration from the iconic imagery and fiery rhetoric of the 1963 march, using it as both a beacon of hope and a scathing critique. Through the same city streets they march, on the same pavements they chant, demanding the same fundamental human rights. Yet they navigate a world transformed by the digital age, where social media surveillance and innovative forms of resistance shape their battle. The March on Washington was never intended as the finale. It was a flare in the night, a stake driven into the ground proclaiming, "This is who we are, this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. And so the dream persists, bruised, challenged, reinterpreted, but vibrantly alive. Whether it is deferred, twisted, or one day realized, hinges not on the echoes of the past, but on us. On the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the bravery we muster to march forward time and again until the dream becomes our shared reality. As we close this series, we extend our heartfelt gratitude for joining us on this journey. Your engagement fuels our mission. Please take a moment to comment, like, share, or subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep the conversation alive, pushing forward for a world where justice and equality are not just dreams, but the very foundation of our society. Thank you for watching.